So you're making a permanent? Yeah. A lot of people are going to sell some money, but
I'll get a hold of it.
so now there's a best. After I had lived in chance I just kind of from where I like to do best. I just picked it, yeah. And it's funny because I've got a brother and a sister, and each one of us did that. Each one of us had quality difference. My sister's in California. My brother is now he's but I was always I thought it was I found that was for me originally, so we were there vacation.
Nope.
I was like, explain it to many of the politics because I don't really understand it. Just change. Oh, it is. It is.
So that's
Check, sound check. We'll be starting shortly here. Turning on the sound system, please. Check.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ahavath Torah congregation. Just a couple of ground rules before we get started. If you have these, we ask you please to put them on silent or turn them off. Okay, as you can see, we have cameras around. We're recording this. No need for you to record this. If you do record this, it'll just be a waste of your time because the whole evening will be posted online. We're also live streaming. I'd like to thank those who are helping us take on this task. Trento Vision, the United West, is live streaming this evening's event, as well as Tea Party Community. My friends, you should know this is going out to roughly 250,000 people across the country. So all of you in cyberspace, thank you for tuning in. If you would like to help what we do here through the Hausman Memorial Speaker Series and JST events, for those of you in cyberspace, please go to the jstevents.com website, and certainly you'll be able to find all the contact information you need. So that's number one. That's number one. Number two, for those of you who are here, you'll find these little turquoise sheet with some of the upcoming events that we have here. On September 22nd, the second ATC Bob Lazarus Memorial Comedy Extravaganza featuring Stephen Wright, Jimmy Tingle, Lenny Clark, Tony V, Frank Santarelli, Tommy Gilmore, Mike Donovan, Mike McDonald, Emily Singer, and about another dozen comedians as well. You can find information about this event at jimmytingle.com or at the synagogue website, atorah.org. On October 10th, a special screening of Losing Our Sons. For those of you who may know, Carlos Bledsoe was an African American from a Baptist family converted to Islam. There was an incident, if you want to call it an incident, in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Carlos Bledsoe, who in the name of Allah attacked, shot, and murdered an U.S. Army recruiter, Andy Long. We'll preview a little bit of the film there here that evening. Melvin Bledsoe and Darius Long, fathers of both men, will be here to speak at the event. Registration information will be... who said woo? Margot, I should have known. Information will be forthcoming at the jstevents.com website shortly. We're also involved with an event on October 20th. Former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, will be coming to downtown for the Genesis Awards. Information also at JST Events. You may take these sheets with you. If you're out in cyberspace, please, as I mentioned, the jstevents.com website. To say that the world is aflame, I think would be an understatement. We have events in Syria. We have Egypt, at least those of us who know anything about the Middle East and doctrinal matters dealing with the Middle East predicted what was going to happen in Egypt 2-3 years ago. Did we not? Did we not? Tunisia, China, Russia. What does it take for people to accept reality? To understand that our way of life, our view of the world is under attack. Externally and internally. And most often the external and the internal just overlap with one another. If you want to be an adult and look at the world in an adult manner, what do but accept the failings of the past, strive to do better, do what is right, And as Alan West said a couple of weeks ago when he was here, get involved. Get involved. For those of you who are Jewish here, those on the internet, you know that Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, is right around the corner. We are at the beginning of the season where we are supposed to be introspective, to look at where we've been and to determine where we need to go in a positive manner. Our speaker tonight really writes about this multi-layer in our lives in this country. And I just mentioned to Diana in the hallway in the back, I really take a look, having read both her books. I really think that her latest book, American Betrayal, is really the bookend to her first book, Death of a Grown-Up. You have to be an adult, you have to be a grown-up to take responsibility. To take responsibility means you have to understand the faults that we have suffered and then how to work toward a better America. Security issues, deception, foreign and domestic, you can't blame these things on other people. My friends, please welcome my dear friend, Diana West.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Let's make sure I've got the microphone working for everybody. I want to thank Rabbi Hausman so much for this invitation to speak here. We've actually been working on this event tonight for several years. I had to keep turning down these wonderful invitations from him because I kept telling him I'm working on a book. I can't leave. I can't leave my post at my desk. And now it's done and I'm here and I'm very happy to be here. I'm also happy to be here. I'd like to note, because this is a very illustrious stop on the speaking tour of the world at this point. This has become one of the great podiums for some of the greatest heroes of free speech and counter-jihad. And yes. So it is doubly an honor to appear here. I know that just a couple of weeks ago, Alan West was here. And I know he also told people that to come and see his big sis, which is what he calls me, I'm proud to say. This started back before anybody, probably in this room anyway, knew who Alan West was very much. Back when he was a contractor in Afghanistan after the army had almost court-martialed him for defending his men. And he avoided that, but he was working in Afghanistan at the time, and I had written a column, a very fast column. I was on my way to vacation, but I had to write a quick one, and I did about a dream, I might say, that this was a moment when then President Bush was having surgery, and very briefly he turned over the reins of power to Vice President Cheney. And I wrote a column about all the wonderful things I thought Cheney might do in that about 3/4 of an hour, hour and a half that he had to be president. And I had quite a list, and one of the things was to award Alan West a medal of honor for what he had done. And this was one of my achievements for then my notion of President Cheney. And lo and behold, I started hearing from Alan West, and we've been friends ever since. And before that, I know that Lars Hedegaard was up here. I first met Lars on a tour of Europe in 2008 to look at the jihad in Europe, best way to put it, and I had a tour at the time of Copenhagen from Lars, and now I'm actually a Washington correspondent for Lars's new newspaper, Dispatch International, which is also available in English online. And I know before that, Elizabeth Sabadich-Wolf was here. And Elizabeth is another great hero of free speech and a good friend. I actually have her Wiener Schnitzel recipe. And of course, Herert Wilders, marvelous champion, great hero to us all. And my claim to fame with Herert would be I am the first American print reporter to have interviewed him back in 2008. So, well, thank you. That was just good luck. So tonight I'm going to be talking about my book, which came out at the end of May. Sorry, I just want to get this right. It came out at the end of May from St. Martin's Press. It's my second book, American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. And it came out and to some wonderful notices and truly remarkable to a writer who's been sitting in the dark for years writing a book. And I say dark because I do most of my writing in the dark of morning, not dark of night. I'm not a good writer at night, but I get up very early in the morning to work. And lately, however, it has become a subject of great controversy, which I'm actually still in the middle of. And indeed, this is my first public address since this great controversy over my book began. I've spoken plenty on the radio and television, but this is my first sort of eyeball-to-eyeball appearance, which is nice. I'm very happy to be here again and to talk about this, because I would like, before I get into what my book is about, I would like to get into a few things that my book is not about, because there has been, some of you may or may not be aware, but there has been quite a lot of discussion on the internet that started with a review of my book on August 7th, a 7,000-word review by Ronald Radosh at Front Page Magazine that I am in the midst of rebutting and hope to have my rebuttal up and running next week, certainly at my website, dianawest.net, for anyone who's interested. But a lot of things have been said about me and my book that I just wanted to put out there in terms of dispelling these well, they range from distortions, lies, calumnies, smears, that kind of thing. Because this review, I think, was best described by Radosh himself, who wrote several subsequent pieces, one of which was titled, "Why I Wrote a Takedown of Diana West's Awful Book." So takedown, I think, is the operative word here. And I think that it was a takedown in the sense that it was not really a discussion of what is in my book or a discussion about my book. I think it was a discussion of something else. And that's what I'm really working through in my own rebuttal. But I think it's important, just a few of the very odd characterizations. For example, I did not call Eisenhower a communist. It's not in my book. I did not call or even describe Winston Churchill as a Soviet dupe. It's really not in my book. And the great thing about ebooks is people can actually get the electronic version and check me. So I recommend that you do that if you don't take my word. Another thing I did not, this one I actually had to write down, it was so bizarre. I did not consider an entente with Hitler's army against Stalin. This is not in my book at all, nothing resembling that. Another claim, I did not claim that the United States sent fissionable material to the Soviet Union. Again, another book perhaps, but not mine. This is the kind of thing I'm wading through. And part of the reason this rebuttal period has been taking so long, because there's just nothing real to grab onto, so I have to kind of walk back a lot of absolutely false charges and kind of unravel them and figure out where they might have come from. And anyway, so I'm getting close to the end of that, and it should be an interesting period that we enter into after that is published, and some other surprises. But one thing that came up in this controversy, which is more important, particularly thinking about all the people who have preceded me at this podium, who are champions of free speech. David Horowitz, who very much owns this assault on my book, he thought of the title of the review, which is McCarthy on Steroids. He wrote that he thought of it, and he has written a couple of pieces that may be considered attacks on me and my book since. One of the things he said, which is really, I'm still puzzled by and kind of a little bit reeling from just the concept of, quote, she should not have written this book. Who says that about someone or a book? And when you think about the people before me who are all championing freedom of expression, freedom of speech, say what you think, freedom of conscience, all of these things, this becomes a very important part of the controversy. What does it mean when someone doesn't want a book written or ideas put out there? And I think that is part of what I've been trying to work through in working on the rebuttal. And what I've come to, and it's actually very pertinent to the book itself. I mean, we're almost talking about boxes on boxes or inside boxes or concentric circles. A lot of what my book is about, which I will get to shortly, has to do with the construction of narrative, of a design of a series of events to fit either an ideology or a political purpose or some other artificial understanding. In other words, not the clearest, fullest, most comprehensive, most transparent, most open sequence of events for people to parse through, but rather sort of an edited version. And I think that what American Betrayal does more than anything else, and I hope you will read it for yourselves and you know, make this determination for yourself, not just let me tell you or let someone else tell you something else, is it messes with this whole notion of constructing narratives. It tries to reveal, it tries to lift the curtain on the puppet masters, the people behind the scenes who are hoping to put over certain ideologies or certain political narratives, and tries to open everything up to public scrutiny, which as a journalist, this is you know, something that drives me in my career. We are very much at a point in journalism, for sure, where journalists are very content to take what an authority figure gives them. Take a press handout, don't ask the president any difficult questions, that kind of thing. And what I'm looking at in American Betrayal in a historical perspective is this idea of how this comes about, how this becomes our norm, how in America, the land of the First Amendment and everything else we have, all the other liberties we have enshrined in our Constitution and Bill of Rights, gets to a point where we are so content with so little and are so content for our leadership to get to a point where so much is hidden from us. And so I think what American Betrayal does more than anything else is it tries to open the doors and, to continue with the cliche, let the sun shine in and see what we can see and try to put things together perhaps with a more fuller comprehension of facts and a more logical and more pointed purpose, and not a narrative, not an ideology, not a political story. It's a very challenging book. I think it's very challenging for readers because it asks a lot of you. It asks a lot about you putting aside your preconceived notions about what we know of our past, what we've been taught from our earliest experiences in school and high school and college. And it also argues that much of what we actually know about ourselves as a country is in fact a series of big lies. Now, we associate big lies with totalitarians. We associate them with Stalin, the inventor, and Hitler, his great student, but we tell them too. And some are easy to spot because we've discarded them. For example, our government used to refer to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe. I mean, this is, you know, a serious thing. Our leadership, our President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Uncle Joe was their catchphrase for this man who had already killed more people than Adolf Hitler would kill in the whole war. This was the depth of the propaganda war that was surrounding our alliance with Stalin. We were also told, President Roosevelt told us in 1941 that under the Soviet Constitution there was freedom of religion, just like here. This was another lie. So, you know, where do these things come from? And do we have them today? Now, one thing, again, as a post-9/11 journalist I deal with all the time, Islam is a religion of peace. Another big lie. I mean, one thing we can say about Islam, it is not a religion of peace. We get hit on 9/11, and the president tells us that Islam is a religion of peace, and then for the next decade plus, because now we're quite a number of years over, every statement permitted and promoted in the public square by pundits or politicians has to support this illogical construct. And that actually is how I began my book. I began trying to understand this. And we have Andrew Bostom in the audience, who's one of the great pioneers of our modern time in trying to understand the facts about Islam. How this can be so that this is where we are in the state of our debate. And I actually set out to, and kind of in an extension of the death of the grown-up, which also is examining the Western mind under the impulsive, or the impact of Islam, how we could get to a point where the facts about jihad and Shariah and dhimmitud being, of course, the suppressed and repressed and secondary, third, tertiary condition of non-Muslims under Shariah, how these could all be sitting out there in plain sight, and yet we work as if they're not there, and we pretend them away, and indeed scorn, isolate, smear those people who want to bring these facts to the public square and say, this is reality, how do we deal with it? I would say that that's probably been the main theme of most of the columns I've written for the past almost 12 years. And I became particularly attuned to how these problems are not addressed in the corridors and platforms of power and debate. So my thought was, when I got St. Martin's interested in another book for me, was there a precedent for this institutional failure in society to confront threats to Western-style liberty? Was there a precedent for telling lies in our society at the institutional level? I mean, of course, lying, we have a commandment against lying. Lying is nothing new. But in terms of on the institutional level, was there anything here to learn? Was there anything new? And so what I seem to be examining and looking for, and believe me, it took me a long time to find my legs on this research. I started this book in 2009. I didn't really know where it was going. I certainly didn't know what I would uncover in the archives and in the literature. But I realized I was looking into kind of a perversion of logic as much as a loss of courage. So, in other words, to state that Islam is a religion of peace can be understood as not only illogical but also ideological. And I started finding parallels in our past. For example, in 1938, J.B. Matthews, who is one of my books, I call them the truth tellers, the people who were either the witnesses or the investigators who were trying to bring some semblance of reality to the narrative makers, I guess you could call them. J.B. Matthews described red baiting, which I realized if we have Islamophobe today, we had red baiter yesterday. He called red baiting the best trick ever invented short of a firing squad for making short work of anybody who dares to object to communist theories and practices. If he is not effectively silenced, he is at least thoroughly discredited among the vast flock of citizens who enjoy thinking of themselves as liberals. Ideology. This was my common thread. And of course, there are many similarities between Islam and communism. We have Islam, of course, a religion, is also collectivist, totalitarian, and at odds with rule of law-based liberty. Communism, which has always inspired a religious-like devotion among its followers, is also a collectivist and totalitarian ideology at odds with rule of law-based liberty. It also has, among its believers, there is a sense of inevitability that, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. But there is a sense of inevitability that also works hand in glove with sort of the fatalism of Islam. And in looking in this way, I began to discover that, much to my amazement, during World War II, the US government embarked on a campaign to whitewash communism that is uncannily similar to the campaign to whitewash Islam in our country by the federal government after 9/11. So what was going on? I mean, again, this is where I was coming into this research, this period of research. It seemed like a cover-up of reality in both cases to serve ideological ends. And then out of this, I ended up with with my thematic structure, kind of a new way to approach U.S. history in the last century, not so much as a struggle between communism and the free world, but between the forces of concealment and the forces of exposure. And I would just like to read the first paragraph of the book, because this is really where it all came together for me, and I think it'll illustrate what I'm talking about. It's called, appropriately enough, The Beginning. Sometime in 1934, two men got off separate trains at Union Station in Washington, D.C. They had arrived in the nation's capital to fight on different sides of a war. It was a war few Americans knew or even now know was raging all around the capital. One man in his early 30s had come to expand the reach of the secret communist apparatus already entrenched inside the U.S. government. The other man, age 60, had come to expose it. The name of the younger man was Whittaker Chambers. Later, he would become the most famous ex-communist to bear witness to the conspiracy he had served. The older man, William Wirt, would die in obscurity. Now, this was a case where William Wirt was actually far more famous than Whittaker Chambers was at this time. Of course, Whittaker Chambers was a spy. He was underground. He was opening up a network. That very day he came to Washington in the spring of 1934. He met his first new contact. His name was Alger Hiss. William Wirt at this point was famous. There had been the equivalent of a 1934 24/7 news cycle across the country to expose the fact that, or to cover the fact that William Wirt had made some very inflammatory charges, very sensational charges about revolution brewing at a dinner party outside Washington in the fall of 1933 that he had attended. 6 guests, all New Dealers, mid-level people, and he was so unnerved by what he heard. He'd been invited by the hostess, who used to be a secretary, he was an educator, that he started writing letters to everyone important in the country, newspapers, anyone he could think of, and he had something of a name from his work as a superintendent of schools, but it didn't get him very far until an industrialist of the day, James Rand, read his letter, his entire essay, into the congressional record, where this man Rand was testifying about about Wall Street, actually. And that's what started this news cycle, this thing that went on for months, and it became, Wirt became the butt of jokes. He was the president of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt made jokes about him, the First Lady. There were cartoons, there were verses. It was a tremendous, when you go back and look at the old papers, it's a tremendous fireball that he caused. He came to testify. The Democrats who had just taken Congress in this early New Deal period, which was very dynamic for Roosevelt, of course, they decided to look into it to make it go away. And indeed, I call this the first American show trial, because what happened was they set up a small committee, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. Wirt was not allowed any of the traditional niceties and actual traditional format of appearing before a committee and bearing witness to something. He was not allowed to read a statement. He wasn't allowed to have his lawyer. He wasn't allowed to cross-examine witnesses. He wasn't allowed to call. It was an absolute, seal-up Wirt. The 6 dinner party guests, however, all testified that Dr. Wirt there couldn't have been talk of revolution at this dinner party, because Dr. Wirt had never stopped talking. And this was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guests, all had the same story to tell. And this generated more jokes and more really calumnies against Dr. Wirt. So why is this important to us? He was essentially voted 3-2, straight party line, as a liar, and disappeared, and they say died of a broken heart a few years later. It's important because one of the Democrats on this committee later on wrote a public mea culpa after Dr. Wirt died and apologized for helping his role in turning the screws on Dr. Wirt. He talked about how the witnesses had actually colluded on their stories, how what Dr. Wirt said had come to pass and was true, and that this was, this terrible strain on the Democratic ex-congressman's soul at this point. It was very dramatic. It's quoted in the book. Nothing really happened. This didn't run in any of the important papers. It seemed to be something out in the countryside. And But there's still another PS to the story, which is 3 of the 6 other guests, we later find out after we get records from KGB archives and other sources, 3 of those guests were Soviet agents or assets. So Dr. Wirt had actually found himself sitting in the middle of kind of an ancillary cell, a kind of a group of people who really were probably discussing revolution in the terms that he tried to describe. So why is this relevant to my book and this whole discussion? This is the kind of witness, truth teller who comes up, gets smacked down by the echo chamber and concealed and run over by the narrative, gone. I mean, how do we even know? I don't even remember how I found Dr. Wirt. I mean, he pops up now and then in old narratives, but I mean, this is the kind of thing. He's the first in this particular episode. And this became my structure, concealment versus exposure. The struggle between those who sought to hide the communist conspiracy and those who sought to bring it into the open. And that really gives you a new way of looking at our past. And the question becomes, well, who won? And I actually think it's quite clear that the communist conspirators, the people who were doing these things and trying to do these things as best they could, actually won in terms of keeping the extent and, more importantly, the implications of their activities a secret. And just to give you an example quickly of what I mean, Alger Hiss, straight up Soviet agent, confirmed, I's dotted, T's crossed, all of that, no question about it. He oversaw the formation of the United Nations. Do we ever think about that? Do we ever think a Soviet spy oversaw the formation of the United Nations? Another Soviet spy, Harry Dexter White, again, no question about it. He oversaw the International Monetary System, the IMF, the World Bank. Do we ever think about that? I mean, it seems like there's a gulf between what we know. For example, a lot of people know that those 2 men appear in KGB cables and so on and can be identified as having been working for Stalin. And yet the connection to what they did doesn't really seem to be in our brains. It certainly wasn't in my brain when I started this research. So this is what I started getting very fascinated by. What is it in our brains that we reject this or can't process it or aren't encouraged to process it or are discouraged from processing it? So this is kind of what I began examining, were kind of the blanks in our understanding that I think make our claim of victory even in the Cold War very problematic. Because, of course, anyone who's gone to college understands that most campuses are essentially outposts of Marx. If you're interested in free enterprise, you find that very quickly. Thinking of the college campus, imagine Elizabeth Bentley, an American spy for Stalin who very famously broke with the conspiracy in 1945, walked into an FBI office, and was able eventually, over a period of briefings, to identify correctly, we now know correctly, 140 agents and collaborators. And she went to Vassar, but do we expect Vassar to put up a statue to Elizabeth Bentley for revealing all these scores of traitors who are trying to bring down our Constitution? No, and it will not happen. It can't happen. I mean, I think the first reaction to hearing it is, of course not. Why? Again, why do we not recognize someone's contribution like that? And indeed, most people, if you give them, free association, they will come up with the word neurotic, spinster, that kind of thing. So what's going on? And then more and more as I looked into this, I found that the truth tellers, the people who tried to expose activities hostile to our Constitution, directed by a foreign government, very serious matters. It was a dirty intelligence war waged against us. The people who tried to stand up and say, this is what's going on, stop, or what's going on, any of those variations, they became toxic. And they are still remembered that way. That is kind of what I was looking at. William Wirt is just one. We have a man named George Racy Jordan who gave sworn testimony to Congress in 1949 and 50 regarding the shipment of uranium and heavy water to the USSR during World War II, at a time when the Manhattan Project had an embargo on these kinds of shipments. Why don't we know that? I mean, when I read about this man, and I actually studied Jordan at length in the book, I try to test him as a witness, because how do you even evaluate these things now? And you try to go back and see, well, what was proven by the congressional investigators, and most of his charges were proven. The open questions are come down to things he witnessed but no one else did. But when there's a document that can tell you what the plane number was, and a shipping late, a bill of shipping from Canada that tells you where the uranium came, all these things the investigators could put together, and you realize he was an excellent witness. Why don't we know about him? You know, what happened? It was a big news in 1950, confirmed uranium shipments to the Soviet Union during the entire, this was a time when in 1949, the Soviet Union shocked the world by exploding an atomic bomb. These are important pieces of our past. Where did they go? They are now in my book, but where did they go for the past decades? This was what I was looking for. Another witness to these sorts of things would be, you may have seen a column that Rabbi Hausman Xeroxed of mine, Julius Epstein, another one of my truth tellers, a refugee from Hitler who made gigantic contributions as a reporter, setting the record straight on the Katyn Forest massacre of some 20,000 Polish officers by the Soviets, but accepted by the United States and Britain from World War II forward to about 1950, officially, as a German crime. This was absolute Soviet propaganda that was taken to become official guidance by the United States and Britain until Julius Epstein came along in the late 40s and began reporting on Katyn. And his reporting, I mean, this is, reporter's dream, it triggered congressional investigations that actually established a record on the massacre that is so vitally important. And it's one reason why Congress today should be encouraged to do these sorts of select investigations, because they can get the record straight, they can subpoena, they can put it all there so we know what happened. If this hadn't happened in 1950 with Katyn, much of this record, much of the people involved, the people who could bear witness, could tell what happened, it would be gone from us. So that's the importance of this kind of work. He also did tremendous investigative work on something called Operation Keelhaul. And I don't know how many of you in the room have ever heard of it. How many people have heard of Keelhaul? Not very many. There's nothing wrong with you. This is a major puzzlement and irresponsibility in our own educational and our own understanding of history. Operation Keelhaul, that Julius Epstein worked for years, if not decades, trying to expose, was the name given to the project to repatriate at least 2 million Soviet-claimed nationals who were in Europe at the end of World War II who did not want to go back to the Gulag and to Stalin. And they were forcibly returned. Very often, they killed themselves. Very often, they threw themselves. I mean, the stories about what they did to avoid being returned to Soviet Union from about 1944 to 1947, when this was going on, are absolutely heartrending. And our tragedy is that American and British troops became the enablers of this. Stalin couldn't get these people from Western Europe. His troops weren't in Western Europe, but Americans and British forces and some of the other Allied forces delivered these people. And it's interesting, I hear from people who have read my book, who have had some connection to some of the events, and one of them was a man whose father was put on a train. He was in Austria. His father was a displaced person with his family at the end of the war, and I believe they were from the Balkan area or something, and they were told by the British they were being taken to Italy, and actually the train was going the other way, and they jumped off and lived. And I mean, that's the kind of history that is touching people even today. This is something that Julius Epstein was very important in unearthing. But again, even though he wrote a book that came out called Operation Keelhaul in 1973, I think it was, we don't know it, but it's part of our history. And it's also, relevant to note this was going on during the Nuremberg trials. Now, when I set out to write this book, I had no idea I would be uncovering such things, and I was truly, just personally appalled by what I was finding. And I note that I am writing and saying this, with some personal connection to some of these events myself. My father, the late Elliot West, was a veteran of World War II. He was in the Normandy invasion. He walked ashore onto Omaha Beach on D-Day +2, and would fight across Northern Europe and actually cross into Germany. Right around, he didn't always, he mentioned once or twice to me, a little town called Monschau, just over the German border. Beautiful. I actually had the chance to visit it a few years ago. Now, he had come ashore in a summer uniform, and he was still wearing it late that year in 1944, and he ended up getting very sick. And he got a very high fever, and apparently there's a certain number on the thermometer where you hit it, they take you off the front line. And he was pulled off the front line right before, very shortly before, the German army mounted its final breakout that we know most familiarly as the Battle of the Bulge. And my father's position was at the front at this point, and the casualties suffered by the other groups in that line, were extensive, if not, complete. So it was one of those breaks that surely I would not be having this conversation had he not gotten ill. It's one of those tricks of fate. But the main reason I bring it up is that his war was really bookended by the Normandy invasion and the Battle of the Bulge. And lo and behold, as I continue in my very unconventional research, I soon came to my own realization, my own theory, that neither of those battles might have happened had it not been for the impact of these communists inside the policy-making chain in Washington. And that, I know, is a very shocking statement. And part of the reason my book is in the first person is I actually set out to recreate my own sort of chain of understanding, because none of it makes sense to any of us who are prepared with the narratives we all come to the subject with, and I certainly was not. But what I mean by that is there were hundreds of agents who have been identified. The very famous Cold War expert, or the Venona KGB cable experts, intelligence experts, John Haynes and Harvey Clare, in their book they wrote with Alexander Vasiliev in 2009 called Spies, actually given a figure of over 500 identified. Now, these are identified from a finite number of documents from the KGB. That particular book comes from some research material known as the Vasiliev notebooks, which are notebooks that this man, Alexander Vasiliev, who is a former KGB agent, actually was able to copy in that period after the fall of the Soviet Union, when there was a lot of opening of archives. And he actually hand copied. I mean, it's kind of an amazing thing. They're available online at the Wilson Center, the Vasiliev notebooks. That particular book draws from that tranche of information. Then, of course, there's the very famous Venona archive, which is more KGB cables that were sent from America, mostly, well, they were communications between America, the Soviet embassy, and so on, back to Russia, back and forth. During World War II, we have 2,900 of those that have been released finally in the 90s, actually after the Russian sources began to be unveiled, which I think is interesting. We did not voluntarily just put these cables out there. We did that in much, you could say, response to what was going on in Russia. But be that as it may, we have 2,900 of these cables that have been painstakingly, but some of them only partly decrypted. Hundreds of the names are not, the code names have not been decrypted. So there's still many mysteries in this 2,900 cable batch. But that cable, 2,900 cables, is I don't even know the fraction. The figure I looked up today to try to figure out how many Venona cables we have not seen, and we don't know if they've been translated. I saw a figure in one book that estimated it as 2 million, that the NSA estimate was 2 million cables. We were given 2,900 by the government. So we don't exactly, the US government, the CIA was the filter on what they let us see. That's where we get our Venona archive. I'm happy to have it, but it has to be understood it's a partial look, and we don't know what else was decrypted. But knowing the extent of this penetration, if you say give it at a number of hundreds or 500 in the government and other institutions, and then you look where they are, because we can do that now. We know enough of the names to look at where they are. Very often they're rather high in the government. They're certainly in the mid-level where most of the work is done. And some of them are extremely high. Some of them are within reach of the levers of power. You have Alger Hiss at the State Department, who became very, very influential particularly over Secretary of State Stettinius in 1945. You have Lachlan Curry, one of President Roosevelt's top aides in the White House, dealing with China, which did, of course, go communist, as we all recall. You have, at the Treasury Department, you have Harry Dexter White, as mentioned, very close to Morgenthau, the secretary. We have a lot of information on what he was able to shape. Again, this isn't stealing secrets, this is shaping policy. At the OSS, which is the precursor of the CIA, you have Wild Bill Donovan, the founder. His top aide is a man named Duncan Lee, another agent. So you're looking at it's almost like a shadow government, or not a shadow government, but underneath the top men, there are people who do not have American interests at their heart. And that affects things. It isn't necessarily that they're running things, they're not controlling things, they're not in charge, but they're moving around and they're doing things, and maybe they're preventing someone with the other side from getting to the big man, or maybe they're just smiling on a certain policy, maybe they're protecting someone from a security investigation, maybe they're spotting talent. I mean, there are many things that happen in an influence, in the part of espionage known as influence or deception, disinformation. This is what's going on. It's harder to codify than when you actually see someone stole a secret, or someone's handwriting is, in a stolen formula. It's not that concrete. It's not concrete very often. But this is where it was, and what I track, and my book, I think the worst charge in the controversy, and the most important, I think, to overcome, is that the Radosh Review and then the copycat reviews that source him, they didn't read my book, but they source his information, none of them acknowledge the fact that I have 900 plus endnotes, and that my sources are State Department records, congressional investigations, memoirs, letters, private papers, of course, military, diplomatic histories, biographies, newspapers, magazines. I mean, this is a densely documented book, and the charge of it being a conspiracy theory or yellow journalism doesn't wash if you then say, this is a book of yellow journalism with 900 plus endnotes. I mean, it doesn't mesh, because yellow journalism is sensationalism without sourcing. And one thing I got is sourcing. But, certainly you can take issue with my own conclusions, but the sourcing is in the book, and I hope people, judge it for themselves and do their own exploration, because believe me, there's a lot more to explore here. This is just one shot at it. Another upsetting thing that ties into why D-Day and why the bulge might not, I mean, obviously this is guesswork, but might not have been necessary. And this is probably the most sensational claim of all that I make, and the most upsetting. Chapter 10 of my book is devoted to something I had never heard of. Maybe people in the room have heard of this, but it's the German underground. I think a lot of Americans never heard of the German underground at all until they saw a Tom Cruise movie called Valkyrie a few years ago, and I don't know if that many people saw that. And it might have seemed like science fiction, because who ever imagines there is such a thing? Oh, excuse me. There was. And I found that it was documented. I found books about it. I found Alan Dulles, who of course became well known as the CIA director later. He had been an OSS man in Switzerland. He wrote a book called The German Underground. I'd never heard of that. I found that there were books by others, articles, memoirs, discussions, all manner of things describing anti-Nazi, anti-communist Germans in an array of groups. Military, business, political, they overlapped, they were different, there was a number of them, and they, for a period of time, particularly in 1943, had mounted many outreach, if you want to call it that, outreach efforts to British and American emissaries. who were excited about what they were hearing, because generally it was the same offer every time. It was, we will deliver Hitler and the Nazi high command to you, we will surrender German armies to American and British forces, we would like unspecified aid, some kind of help keeping the Red Army out of Central and Eastern Europe. And the emissaries, who include, for example, there's an American Berlin bureau chief named Louis Lochner, who wrote about this extensively. In 1942, he brought home to Washington such a bid from, essentially a peace parley and interest in setting up relations from Prince Louis Ferdinand that was turned down by Lachlan Curry at the White House, Soviet spy. This is what I found in a footnote. I couldn't believe it. This is the kind of moment, where you see something fit. Interesting that a Soviet agent would stop a peace feeler from an anti-communist, anti-Nazi, because, and here's where it gets kind of amazing to me, in 1942, in 1943, the Red Army was still in Russia. In other words, we didn't have Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe or Central Europe at that point. They were still fighting their way out. And so at a certain point, as I'm watching various diplomatic developments, it starts to occur to me, and I'm looking at who's involved in them, and I take you through this in the book. It almost seems like the war could not end too soon for the Soviet Union. In other words, the Soviet Union wanted to get into Europe, and it needed the war to go on long enough. And there was a series of these offers that were conducted through a man named George Earle, who had been Pennsylvania governor. He was part of Roosevelt's friends. He was kind of the coterie of the New Deal. He became an emissary abroad, and he was actually, I think he may have been the inspiration for that scene in Casablanca where the Germans, the Nazis, they don't want to hear La Marseillaise, and they have that battle in Rick's Place, if anyone remembers, because Earle, very famously, was in Bulgaria, and there was a Nazi contingent in this restaurant they were all at, and Earle was trying to get the band to play Tipperary. And the Nazis didn't want to hear it, and they had scuffles, and actually the newspapers covered Earle apparently beaning the Nazi officer with a bottle of champagne. So he ended up with quite a few headlines over that, and as a result, I think he was approached later on by some of these Germans, including the head of the German intelligence agency, Abwehr, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Anyway, Earle kept bringing these offers. He had several that he goes through in an article he wrote after the war, long after the war, bringing them to Roosevelt, bringing them to the White House, I should say, because he would send these things in a diplomatic pouch. And he wouldn't get anywhere, and he wouldn't hear back. And that was very often Roosevelt's method of not engaging. He just wouldn't write back. And you don't know who it is, because later I found out that I found a letter of his in his papers, that Earle had actually set up his chain of correspondence to go through Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's top aide, and one of the people I examine at great length in the book for evidence of his own interest in Russian interests. There's quite a dossier of Harry Hopkins here, and this was another place where you see a German effort stop. And it's kind of like finding a possibility of potentially having saved millions of people, millions of Jews, to be sure, millions of other people across Europe, cities that had not been firebombed, Russian forces that had not moved into Europe and set up, the misery of the next decades, the expansion across the world. I mean, it seems like you almost see a possibility, because of course it may not have worked. These plans may not have gone anywhere. The things that the Germans did on their own did not go anywhere, as we all know. But what Alan Dulles wrote, and he was very cognizant of the fact that it was the anti-communism of these people that was stopping them in Washington. He writes at length, and I quote him on this because he was a very interesting observer right in Switzerland watching this, and he was working with different groups through his auspices. What he said was that this could have brought about an ending early to the war, but being anti-communist, they were not smiled upon in either Washington or London. And so you could say, well, they're pro-Soviet, but then you say, well, why? And so this is sort of what I'm looking at. How does this happen? How do we not know about this? How come this has sort of, again, escaped our history? Again, this is not something I set out to research. But what I learned is that we have looked at the war without understanding the backstory. We all look at the war as, in Europe in particular, as the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, fighting together to destroy Hitler. And what I find is a more accurate rendition is Churchill and Roosevelt fighting to destroy Hitler, Stalin fighting Churchill and Roosevelt, and fighting to supplant Hitler, which is very different. It's very different. And how did this come to be? And what I end up going back to is what I consider to be, in a way, that you can describe it as America's fall, November 16th, 1933. And this is the date that America recognized the Soviet Union, normalized relations. This was reversing 4 presidents and 6 secretaries of state who had decided the Soviet Union was a they didn't decide. The Soviet Union was a revolutionary entity dedicated to overthrowing any country in the world that was not communist. And when you think about that date, this was just after the Ukraine terror famine had ended. So you had 6 million people in the Ukraine forcibly starved by Stalin. And 6 months later or so, we normalized relations. And if you scramble history a moment and you think, scrambling history, say in 1945, after 6 months after 6 million Jews were killed, a country normalizes relations with the Nazi government. It's morally unconscionable, as it should be. What about 1933? What did that mean to us? What did it do to us? And this is what I examine, because I argue that this taught us to lie institutionally, because the very agreement was predicated on a lie. The very agreement was a series of promises the Soviet Union signed not to try to overthrow us, not to set up secret cadres in our country to take down our Constitution. And it's a reiteration of this notion over and over again. Well, that's what they were doing, and of course it ramped up after normalization. And then what did we do? We had to look the other way, just as we did on the terror famine. We had to look the other way. We had to look the other way when they were doing these things. This becomes worse during the war with the alliance. We look the other way on Katyn, as I mentioned earlier. We colluded in repatriation. And then you say, well, how could this be? And part of it is, there are many reasons. There's not one reason. It's very complex. And yet you come back to this secret intelligence war that I argue, almost without exception, Cold War historians, World War historians ignore. And if you go to the bookstore or your library shelf and look at some of the most recent books, because say post-1996, after we get the archives in the Soviet Union opening, these same histories do not include this backstory, the dirty intelligence war the Soviet Union was waging the entire time. So you have a pageant. You have a pageant of happy actors. You have a pageant of the big three, and you have a pageant of defeating Hitler, and you have, the Cold War then starts. But no, when you add everything in, when you weave, sort of warp and woof, the backstory, the intelligence war, with the other history, you get this very different look at everything. It all looks different. And I think that in some ways, that accounts for some of the hostility that came to my book in this most recent controversy. I have messed with the narrative simply by bringing to light the work and deeds of others. I mean, it's not a magical invention of mine. I am just simply pulling together the history that really has been in plain sight all this time. And yet, we have somehow ignored it. And I'm just staggered, by that fact. But I was looking at some of these books, particularly the ones that were cited in this Radosh takedown. John Lewis Gaddis, for example, The Cold War, A New History, a 2005 book. It doesn't take this into account. It's a history of the Cold War, and does it discuss Alger Hiss, but maybe in passing, maybe one reference? How do you do that? How do you write a history without taking this intelligence war? And it isn't so much John Gaddis's fault or anything. It's just the mindset and the habit. It's a habit, it's a convention, it's a habit, and so something unconventional comes along. It's difficult for people who want to preserve Roosevelt on a pedestal, Truman as the great Cold Warrior, who I'll borrow Ann Coulter's line, Truman the great Cold Warrior who won the Cold War in Ronald Reagan's administration, and then Joseph McCarthy has to remain the devil figure who was looking for communists that didn't exist. So if you flip it all, it becomes a very different history. The investigators, of course there were others besides Joseph McCarthy, he becomes, the symbolic head of that movement, but there were actually Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate doing marvelous investigations, but we think of them as looking for Reds under the bed. There was nothing there. And then we look at those presidents as being the great stalwarts. Well, then when you actually add in the information of this backstory, things change. It's a disconnect. And the people along the way, again, who I try to highlight, were well aware of this. And they were also, when you read some of the memoirs, for example, I'll read you a little bit from Robert Stripling. He was the original investigator on the House Un-American Activities Committee, which Representative Martin Dies of Texas, a Texas Democrat, opened in 1938. Stripling wrote a memoir, and 10, 12 years later, and he writes toward the beginning, he says, "I want to tell in detail the price that men must pay for the dubious privilege of being reviled in print and on the air, for their labors in what amounts to a necessary sewer project of communist investigations." And he goes on to say that it's his attempt to outline, without conjecture, the scope of the communist conspiracy against the government and the people of the United States, even though to do so is to invite the charge of fascist, red baiter, witch hunter, smear artist. To fail to do so is to capitulate to a resourceful enemy who can endure any counterattack except exposure. Every time I found one of these quotes about exposure, it just was, yes, I understand, it's exposure that is to be avoided. And, again, just the mechanism of the book is quite simple. It is taking into account the cables, the KGB cables, the congressional investigations, the FBI files that are now in the state of our academy, shunted aside into an academic specialty, if they're studied at all. The KGB cables tend to be studied, the others do not. But they are seen as a almost boutique academic industry that just piles up. You get piles and piles of this information, not integrated into the historical narrative. So that's what American Betrayal tries to do. And I argue that this vacuum is really as much at the heart of American Betrayal, because at a certain point you see Uncle Sam, consciously or not, covering up for the Russian bear. Is Uncle Sam covering up for Islam today? Again, I'm moving back and forth between time frames in my mind anyway. We support jihadists across the Middle East. We eradicate the study of Islam and jihad from the security agencies. We vacuum up everyone's records instead. Can we not wonder? The parallels there are extraordinary. In 1943, the Soviet ambassador actually handed a list of anti-communist State Department officials to the State Department and asked them to be fired. And they were. They were not literally fired, but they were sent off the desk to places like Iraq and Turkey and Canada, which were not hot spots during World War II. Their careers were completely disrupted. Intelligence files were broken up. This was something that Harry Hopkins was involved in. There were all manner of efforts to sunder any kind of cogent understanding of communist subversion, or to retain the services of men who had been studying the Soviet Union since the revolution and were realists in the State Department. I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine a State Department with anti-communists in it, but at this time there were, until they were purged. We can twin that with 2011, when we had an array of Muslim American groups come to John Brennan, then President Obama's counterterrorism advisor, and these groups, there were 57 of them. There were several known U.S.-identified Muslim Brotherhood Front groups among them, who asked for a purge, a very similar kind of purge of the security agencies and departments, a purge of trainers they deemed anti-Islamic, training material they deemed anti-Islamic, and it was so done. So again, you see a complete parallel. So it seems like we're capitulating again on an ideological level. Now, we called the last time victory, and I wonder if we'll call this one victory eventually. But what kind of victory for liberty replaces one totalitarian monster with an even greater one? And this is what happened when the Soviet Union supplanted Nazi Germany with its evil empire in Europe. And speaking of evil empire, remember when Ronald Reagan gave his evil empire speech? Well, that was in 1983, and I realized I had never read it, I'd never heard it at the time. And I went back to it, and it's a speech actually about moral equivalence. And I quoted in the book, and the phrase evil empire is almost in passing. And it was seized upon, and it was Reagan who was criticized harshly, absolutely raked over the coals for using the phrase evil empire, not the empire of evil, not the evil of the Soviet Union, which at that point in 1983 probably, could claim 20, 30 million people to killed people, as not even counting the rest of world communism, which the Black Book of Communism quantified, horrifyingly enough, at 100 million deaths to communist dictatorships around the world. I mean, this is the kind of, where's our mindset that gets mad at a man who finally, I mean, it's a fairly trite statement when you think about it, calls an empire evil, and he gets tarred, but not the empire. And then meanwhile today, we say we won the Cold War, and we have a Republican majority in Congress that cannot muster the votes to defund socialized medicine. And that's what Obamacare is, and if we go back in time, we see that after the Bolsheviks came in, one of the first things they did was socialize medicine. It's a method of controlling a population. Our border is in tatters. The Senate doesn't want to defend it. Citizenship is cheap. The Constitution is in tatters. Do you start seeing a resemblance to more of a Marxist-Leninist style progression? I mean, it doesn't have to be every little detail, it doesn't have to be a plan, but this is the movement. It's toward that kind of world. General Albert Wiedemeyer was one of the strategists of World War II, and I draw from his memoir he wrote in 1958. And he wrote, "The irony of it all is that the Soviet empire is largely one of our own creation." It seems right to me. He was looking at the geopolitical map and was arguing that. I would argue that similarly, a kind of Soviet empire took hold here as well in our minds, in our mindset. And I think that we have to look back on some of the complicity with our lies, the Soviet crimes, silences, the silencing of the truth tellers, of the facts about penetration. To this day, something I try to do case by case in my book, and I would argue that it did something to us. And I go back to that moral fall, which is something that Solzhenitsyn wrote about as well, 1933 recognition and 1941 alliance. He wrote about this, and I found it quite compelling, and I discuss his words about this. He felt the same way, and in fact, I certainly thought about this after I read it in him. It seemed to loosen our grasp on morality. It seemed to make us easier to accept the lie, to accept silence in the face of crimes. Something was happening in our mind, and I was very interested to find a fascinating book by a noted military correspondent named Hanson Baldwin. He was a celebrated war correspondent, Pulitzer Prize winner, covered World War II all over the world for the New York Times, and a military analyst. He wrote a book called The Great Mistakes of the War. And when I first came to it, I had no idea what he could possibly be talking about. I didn't understand. But what's interesting is he starts out with 4 great faults of ours. And the thing is, it begins, for example, one, this is one of our great mistakes, that the Soviet Union had abandoned its policy of world revolution. And number 2 was that Uncle Joe was a good fellow, someone we could get along with. And he goes on, there are a couple of more, but the idea is they're all the same in the sense that they are all head fakes. They are all products of propaganda, pro-Soviet feelings, leftism, desires to make this work, and disinformation. Very interesting when you think about a military correspondent coming up with this list. Brainwashing, pro-Soviet propaganda, Then you look at something like the Office of War Information, which was one of the bureaus that sprouted up during the Roosevelt administration, of course, during the war. We had total censorship, war censorship, and you start matching the names on the Office of War Information, you realize you've got them absolutely densely clustered Soviet agents controlling Americans' information on the war. Well, that shapes people's attitudes, it shapes people's understandings. Again, influence. Is that pro-Soviet propaganda or is it Soviet propaganda? I mean, if they're Soviet agents, you cross a line at a certain point. And at that point, it struck me I wasn't looking at, I was looking at kind of a de facto type of mental occupation. Again, looking at this concept of penetration that we tend to ignore. And it seems quite familiar. We hear this about Islam. We hear about the compatibility of America's Constitution with Islamic law, democracy. We're told that jihad is personal struggle, not global conquest. We're told all manner of similar kinds of ideological lies. Interestingly enough, I found that the mantra in the old days was, we mustn't offend the Soviets, which is kind of amazing when we all know about the sensitivities we're supposed to show toward not offending Muslims. Now, I did one of the broadcasts I did was actually, amazingly enough, it was an entire 3-hour show on the internet, and someone wrote me after having listened to all 3 hours and wrote me an email that sort of crystallized everything I just said in the entire book, which sometimes happens. You know, you try to figure out what you're really saying after doing all this research. But he said, essentially you are saying that all of post-1930 American geopolitical World War II and Cold War history, as it has been presented, is a fiction. And I thought, yes, I am really saying that not taking in the whole scope of the story, not taking in what was going on, renders it incomplete to a point of not being comprehensible, it doesn't make sense unless you have all the pieces. So this is kind of unraveling of the conventional wisdom. It's still a work in progress. There's more to learn. I don't think pushback in the sense of silencing this kind of information is the way to go. I think it would be better to hear a real debate based on the facts of the book and not what someone fancies the book should be misperceived to be about. For example, getting back to this notion, Eisenhower was a communist, which is nothing to do with discussing a grown-up discussion of deception or influence on the American government. There's just been too much subversion, too much deception, too much silence. And I would just end by noting that Stanton Evans, whom I consider my mentor, he wrote the very great book Blacklisted by History about Joseph McCarthy that showed that you could assemble a primary document archive and write history to fit the documents, not to fit an ideological point of view. He told me once during my research, he said, when you come back to a document, you always see something new. You always understand it with new depth. And I would just like to end with this anecdote that Vladimir Bukovsky, the Soviet dissident, wrote about not long ago when he was writing about his experiences in the new Russia. He was talking about a point when President Yeltsin, the very first president of Russia, of course, invited him into the archives to mount a Nuremberg-style trial of communism. And Bukovsky went in. He wasn't going to be trying people, because he said that would try 19 million people. He wasn't interested in that, but the system, the concepts, what it did. And he was in there Xeroxing or whatever he had. He was copying, because I guess he knew it was too good to be true. And indeed, the archives did close, but he came out with his own archive. And he wrote that at a certain point, Yeltsin came to him and called the whole thing off and said, we're not interested, we're not going to do it. And he said, why? Why aren't we going to be doing this? And he said, we're getting too much pressure from the West. The West didn't want to try communism. The West didn't want to declare victory. And I didn't understand this until I realized how closely aligned we really had become and how many of these secrets of the Gulag were indeed our own, either from silence, appeasement, collusion. It's a manipulation. Solzhenitsyn wrote, obviously very frustrated, he wrote, "It is as if the West actually does not want to know the truth until the moment when this knowledge has ceased to be of use. And it's a very stunning statement. It's a very disturbing statement. I'm hoping he's wrong. I'm hoping we can learn these truths because as heartbreaking as they may be, they are very much of use to us. They show us the deception that the government is capable of, how false narratives are written, how lives are wasted, how truth tellers are marginalized and forgotten, and that I hope they also show us and teach us to be aware that it is happening again. And I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you. Will you take any questions?
My friends, Diana will take questions. I just, one thing for you, as you were speaking, my daughter's watching this. Just to let you all know, this really is out there. My daughter's watching this at college right now. She sent me a text. This was right as you were saying, mentioning the German anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, anti-communist.
Yeah.
She said, Dad, you taught me about this. I read about this.
I'm impressed.
So how is it? How is it?
Yeah.
Jacqueline, hi, honey.
Hi, Jacqueline.
Do your homework. So you know, how is it that my kid knows this, and you know, all these high schoolers don't? Andy, don't answer that question, because we know what the answer is. It's because I'm her father.
Well, it's
Okay.
true, but it's bully for you. That's fantastic, but it's.
I come from a long line
I
of
know.
anti-communists, so you know.
Not
My
enough.
friends, any questions, please, sir? Oh, and while the microphone's coming over, those of you who are watching on the internet, okay, you do have an ability to Mark, what did we say? Email? It's not email. Live chat your questions in, okay? So please feel free to do so. We will read your questions and Diana will respond to you.
Oh, you hold the mic. Okay. You mentioned Islam and the very fact that that it gets confused with peace, and that our president, who was Yale educated right after 9/11, said Islam is the religion of peace. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that has happened. It certainly has happened since I was a young schoolboy, because in the 50s the term was Mohammedans and Mohammedanism. And you have a wonderful Pentateuch here, which is the British version, and it's wonderful for many reasons, because it's dated in 1936, and many of the stories that go along with the Pashas are tuned to pre-war Europe in 1936, and sort of things that were happening then. And you can look here and see that they talk about Mohammedans, but Islam is not mentioned here. And it's something this is a term that's been rather forced on us. And you can still type in your word processor or on email Mohammedans and Mohammedanism, and it'll come up as if you type it correctly, the spelling checker will say it's fine. And my point is that rather than confuse the homonym Salem with Islam, which is what the point I think, which is why this is all happening, it's a homonym that gets confused in people's mind. Even a Yale-educated president of the United States can get confused. I, for one, and I would hope that all people that write and start and use, go retro and start saying Mohammedanism and Mohammedans to identify that the members of this faith and the faith itself, so that it be not confused with its homonym Salem, close to Shalom, peace. That's the confusion.
But no
It's eliminated.
question. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
She needs to give you the.
All right.
Okay, just a couple of comments. there were underground organizations in Germany that opposed Hitler, that opposed the fascist government. And one of them was White Rose, that you probably know about. And many of these groups tried to get assistance from the United States, from the warring powers. However, these organizations were also penetrated by the Germans. Similarly, the anti-communist groups were penetrated by the communists. So the United States government didn't really know exactly who they were dealing with. Now, because some of them they were moles in the government, in these organizations rather. And there are memorials to the people who were anti-fascists in Berlin. I know I saw it. To Herbert Baum, for example, who was executed. So although this went on, it's a question of trust. The United States government didn't know exactly who to trust because there were moles in them. Also,
well, I'll comment about that just because it still remains the fact that other undergrounds were also penetrated, and just Alan Dulles wrote that the German underground was the only underground that received no U.S. aid. And I think it's more than just a matter of not knowing who to deal with. There were reasons that some people had not to want to deal with them. I would say there's probably a range of reasons, but the Germans were not uniquely penetrated by either Nazis or others.
Just one more point that supports your position. Stalin, before invading Berlin, decided to delay the invasion of Berlin to take over Hungary and Romania. So he could have gone into Berlin earlier, but he kept his army on the outskirts of Berlin or in Germany in order to first penetrate Romania and Hungary. He had his tentacles on all of Europe, and that should have been a warning to Roosevelt and Truman at that time, that he really wanted to expand communism to all of Europe.
Right. Well, I think they were watching this and not doing anything about it, but they were at the same time ordering American and British armies to be diverted or to restrain their own movements forward to permit the Red Army to move forward.
Again, thank you for coming. Again, thank you very much for coming. A couple of comments, then a question. I personally believe that prior to World War II, I think in World War II, the British were very overextended trying to beat Germany and didn't have the finances and everything to continue the war. They would have liked to have handled it if they could. They needed the United States, and I think there was a decision made they would have to work with the Soviets to finish off Germany. So as ugly a situation as it was, and the Cold War came afterwards, I still think the United States and Britain felt they needed the Russians. But the question I had for you is, I did not hear you mention one man who ties in with Alger Hiss, Joseph McCarthy, President Eisenhower, Richard M. Nixon, who they must have hated from day one. How do you find Nixon's history with dealing with all these Soviet agents, etc.?
Yeah. Well, in my opinion, Nixon's finest hour was in his support for Whittaker Chambers. He did not allow the committee to go wobbly, which I think they might have, after Alger Hiss, again, kind of taking this notion of lying to an art form in front of the entire nation, denying everything that Whittaker Chambers had attested to. Nixon plays a role. I don't think I actually go into it that much, but he later, as vice president, plays a big role in kind of the whole Eisenhower White House takedown on McCarthy. So I think at a certain point he's shifting his principles in terms of exposing more. And I think it's kind of interesting to note that in this case, it's a very complicated case that relates to the Army-McCarthy hearings, but President Eisenhower was able to, at a certain point, kind of checkmate the situation vis-a-vis McCarthy by claiming executive privilege over certain White House conversations. And it was something made out of whole cloth. There's no executive privilege. It was not it was something new, or newly used anyhow, a newly used tradition. And then if you fast forward to the Watergate years, at a certain point, we hear the term executive privilege again. Nixon pulls it out of a hat, and it had been applauded by the press and the pundits back in the 50s as a wonderful idea. However, when he tried the exact same thing again in the Watergate era, no one was buying. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But he's an interesting character and important. I think most important in that 1948 situation.
Diana, we have an online question for you, which I'll be reading. Knowing this, along with the infiltration of the MB in the present admin, what would you...
Can you come to the microphone, please? Speak up, we can't hear you.
Knowing all this, along with the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood in the present administration, what would you propose our course of action should be?
Oh, well, I think, again, so many of our answers lie in Congress, or our solutions lie in a functioning Congress. I think our Congress does not function. It abdicates its constitutional responsibilities vis-a-vis war. It abdicates its responsibilities in terms of national security. It's directly related to the question. Last summer, Representative Michelle Bachmann, with 4 other House conservatives, brought up a number of examples of potential Muslim Brotherhood influence on the U.S. policymaking chain in state, Pentagon, Justice, White House National Security Advisor, Office of Director of National Intelligence, and one other, I can't remember off the top of my head, but she had a number of examples that she was calling for an inspector general to just take a look at. She wasn't even audacious enough to, or maybe not senior enough to call for any kind of hearings. This is what the Congress should be doing. She, however, was utterly destroyed in the public square as the second coming of Joseph McCarthy, which in itself was an utter inversion of logic, because if indeed we can now look back on the fact that there was communist infiltration and penetration that the investigators were trying to get their arms around, and that we have further confirmation of today, well, that whole trope starts to unravel. It starts to, or should start to disintegrate. It certainly shouldn't be a buzzword to make someone cower and hide under the desk and never really do anything again in the national security sphere, which in a sense is sort of what we've seen from Mrs. Bachmann in terms of who would step forward at that point and get slammed again. And no one came to her aid in the Congress. It all kind of blew up and went away. But that would be the place where, for example, we've heard a lot about Anthony Weiner and his various travails. His wife, Huma Abedin, comes right out of a Muslim Brotherhood nest. Involvement of herself, her mother is in the Muslim Sisterhood. Her mother heads an organization that is under the rubric of Yusuf al-Qaradawi's Union of Good, which is a U.S. designated terrorist entity created by Hamas leaders to raise money for Hamas. I mean, there's just no wiggle room here. She herself served in her parents' organization and magazine, which is something Andrew Bostom's written quite a lot about, 7 years with a man named Abdullah Omar Nassif, who is, again, U.S.-identified al-Qaeda financier, a completely pivotal figure in her parents' family business. And indeed, she served with him herself for at least 7 years. And the list, it can go on. And so the question becomes, what am I talking about? Why is this important? The press doesn't think so. Well, again, getting back to this notion of influence, getting back to this notion of if she served Hillary Clinton as her top advisor for years, or one of her top advisors certainly, start with a security clearance and say, well, in the family section on the Form 86 that all federal employees who need security clearances need to fill out, they actually ask you, does your family, any family members in any foreign organizations? I mean, just if you start listing them, it seems like the agent's hair would go on fire and something would happen. Did she list them? I mean, this is something Congress could examine and at least begin to find out what's going on, what possible influence does a Huma Abedin have on a Secretary of State who presides over a complete U.S. government tilt toward the Muslim Brotherhood, as we've seen across the so-called Arab Spring. This is what needs to be done. It's not hard. These people have the power. Again, I always think of them as like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. If they click their heels together 3 times, they are seriously empowered people, and yet they have allowed their powers to wither.
I was just going to ask a quick question. How much of the lazy journalism contributes to today's problems? I mean, things aren't exposed because of lazy journalism.
Absolutely.
Talking points, political correctness, and like predetermination. Let's pick on the Zimmerman trial. I mean, that was never a trial. That was a public hanging
Yeah.
from the get-go.
Well, they are supposed to be our...
Do you think it's laziness or is it actually it's ideology? Or what do you think it's?
All of the, it's everything. I mean, again, you know, when you talk about a whole group of people, you can't characterize everyone, but there is certainly laziness, there is certainly pack mentality, there is certainly ideological predisposition, there is certainly a feeling of being part of a court, not a courtroom, but like a monarchical court, following of Obama. You know, it's an atmosphere. I think also, speaking from personal experience, when something is not talked about, something is not talked about. And I would just relate one experience I had some years ago during actually the first Obama McCain election. At the time, I was a regular CNN commentator for the old Lou Dobbs show, and it was in October of 2008. I will never forget it because we had Joe the plumber. Socialism comes up. We had then candidate Senator Obama on the rope line with Joe the plumber in Ohio say something like, you know, I just happen to think it's better when you spread the wealth around, for that comment that just made everyone think, oh my gosh, what's going on? It woke people up, it woke the press up. They actually started doing a little work to find out if Joe the plumber had a license. That's where they went with that. Seriously. And I remember I'd been writing about it, and I'd been writing about some of the extremely radical ties, you know, including communist ties. Franklin Marshall Davis was, you know, Obama's young years mentor. We found out during the campaign, someone on the FBI's list to arrest in case of war with the Soviet Union. He was a communist organizer in Hawaii, and you know, and the list I'm sure you're familiar with of all these people who seemed to incubate Obama, and no one was writing about that either. But I was getting into the notion of the socialism issue because it was quite fascinating. There was actually, at that point, also developments showing that when he first ran for public office in Chicago, he was running on a fusion ticket of the Democratic Party and something called the New Party, which was a socialist party. And so I was writing about this as well. And I remember, though, going on CNN and sitting there in the Washington Bureau, which is just a little room, and thinking, I'm going to mention it, I'm going to say it, I'm going to say the word socialist on television, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And it was that crazy, but it's sort of like, you don't hear it? How can you say it? And it takes a certain, you know, I said it. I did. I didn't really get invited back either. That was really the end of that. But I understand. I mean, not to say even me as in even, but you know, even someone who's seriously compelled to chronicle these things and wants to bring them to public attention, I felt that taboo, and I think that's part of it. That's the best explanation. But I think there is also a serious defensive mechanism. People align themselves with the president. There is, of course, a ideological bias in the press corps. I mean, it's been chronicled to pieces, and they just don't see anything else. And it's a perpetuating problem. Now it becomes worse because more and more they'll take press handouts. There's a terrible practice going on now where journalists are as a matter of routine, submitting quotations to officials for approval. And it's absolutely scandalous. And they don't have to do it. I mean, Access, they are the people, they are much more, again, more powerful than they know. The media the politicians need them. If they all decide we're not going to play by these rules, they have the power to break it.
They're also losing their audience and their customers and their readers.
Absolutely. So it's not good.
Just expanding on the previous question just a bit. Is this a human condition that democracy is a very messy form of government. People desire order in their lives. Democracy demands action, demands being involved. And the press, are they reflecting us, or are we reflecting the press? Is the press guiding our thoughts, or is our laziness, not the press's, but our laziness, creating a non-diverse press? I mean, we have examples in our own community of demonization of commentators. Charles Jacobs, our own rabbi here. Oh, it's just him. You can't believe anything he says, because that's all they say. And mum is the word. No one says a word. So I'm wondering, who is the reflection of whom? During the 30s, did we want, we were having a pretty tough economic time. Did we want the government to be Big Brother on us at that time? Maybe we did.
Oh, apparently. I mean,
and created this
Yeah.
situation. So I'm wondering, should we really examine our own state of mind? And don't be afraid of an audit. Don't be afraid of causing attention to be brought to us. Are we the ones at fault?
Sure. I think all of the above. I think the whole thing is messy, and the whole thing doesn't have pigeonholes or fine lines. We are all creatures of our time, and certainly the journalists are creatures as well. It's a very hard merry-go-round to stop, because at the same time there is a self-selecting process that does create a very liberal media. The mechanism of the media is not one to become ideologically diverse. So that is a problem. That begs, we wonder why you haven't seen the rise of more conservative competition. I mean, you have, for example, in talk radio and so on, but in terms of setting the debate in the halls of power, that remains a very closed shop. And it doesn't seem to relate at all to much of the country, but it still is what is important to the people who do things that are important to us. So it's there's no easy answer. I think you're right, though. This is not just simply a matter of being victimized. A lot of it is our own volition. A lot of it is our own desires. Certainly in the 30s, we saw elections for Roosevelt. You also saw a very vigorous anti-Roosevelt press, and you had they were called the Roosevelt haters. Those people, they were demonized. I mean, there's all manner of really kinds of forms of civil war under these kinds of ideological struggles.
And if everybody can stand up when they're asking their questions, so you can show a shot.
Thank you so much. It's brilliant, marvelous research.
Thank you.
For coming and talking with us.
Thank you.
Is Grover Norquist a Muslim infiltrator into the Republican Party?
Well, that's a very good question. He certainly does represent a vector of Muslim influence. I don't know if he is a Muslim. I don't know if that's really important. One of his sort of protégés in terms of advancing in sort of the party mechanism in Washington is a man named Suhail Khan, who does come out of a very strong Muslim Brotherhood background. His father was a founder of the Islamic Society of North America, which is, U.S. government-declared Muslim Brotherhood front group. Norquist has certainly sought to eliminate, in terms of debate, the anti-jihad or counter-jihad representatives in Republican or conservative circles, and he's been quite powerful and effective at doing so. So if you look at the actions, that becomes a perfectly legitimate way to understand them. And I think that this is an ongoing problem. You know, the very important, influential group CPAC has certainly been dominated by the ideological tilt of Grover Norquist, and to the exclusion of representatives of the more counter-jihad type commentators and also political figures as well. I mean, this is an ongoing problem. It's something that Frank Gaffney speaks very eloquently about and with great knowledge, and I would recommend his work online, which is very easily accessible on this particular issue.
Or at unitedwest.org.
And at theunitedwest.org.
Do you consider Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden truth tellers?
That's a really good question. I consider, I'm sorry? Oh, yes. The question was, do I consider Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden truth tellers? Edward Snowden, to start with Edward Snowden, I do believe, is giving us, apparently, information that is vital to any kind of possible reconstruction of an American republic based on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The government's secrecy, the government's rampant abuse of our privacy, the search and seizure, Fourth Amendment, and so on, it is a disgrace. It is an utter cataclysm. In terms of, you know, you look at, well, he went to Russia, well, he went to China, well, you know, where else could he go is one thing. You know, there certainly is it would have to go to it goes to a hostile country. It's a very complex issue. Did he defect from America? I mean, what is America? What is a Stasi state that the NSA has created? Do we call that America and condemn him in no uncertain terms for breaches of our national security? I mean, no, I don't. I personally am not nearly as categorical in my condemnation of Snowden as many of some of my dear colleagues who look at this as a terrible national security breach. I'm sure it is, and yet then I come back to, what is it breaching? What is this NSA super state, this Stasi state? Is that America? Is that what we salute when we salute the flag? Is that America? I don't think so. And I don't really understand Edward Snowden's motivations or much about him, in the sense of, we can't. Goodness knows what state he's in. Is he on a rack somewhere being shot full of truth drugs to get even more information about? I mean, I don't envy him in any way. But I am very glad for the information, so I feel I owe him a debt of gratitude. But it's certainly not a cut and dried question. On Bradley Manning, I have yet to be persuaded that what he released hurt anyone or compromised anything. I haven't seen that proven. What I do see is documents, as I understand it, that I have made use of in WikiLeaks, that all journalists have made use of in WikiLeaks, that were previously available to hundreds of thousands of federal employees with secret clearances. So again, what exactly, it may be more complicated than that, but in terms of on the face of it, what are we looking at? What are we looking at? Someone who truly gave up secrets that are precious to our security, to our most vital interests? It doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be more a matter of the state growing a super secret state. I mean, I don't even know how many people have that top secret clearance at this point, but it's probably about 1 million. So 1 million of our fellow citizens can read all this stuff, and yet that's considered so secret that if it leaks to the press, who then makes use of it, and we find out the government's been lying to us about X, Y, and Z, it becomes hard for me to condemn either of them. I'm not sure if I call them truth tellers exactly. I haven't quite settled on what I think about them, but I tend to be thankful for the information, and And I'm not sure where I actually end up at the end. I'm still working on it, because I think it is a complicated question, because it seems to be treason, a kind of treachery toward the country. You take its secrets out the country and leak them, and yet they're leaking them to us. And it's telling us things about the government that need to be stopped. I mean, do we really want all of our emails and all of our conversations and all of our contacts, if we have European contacts or a foreign correspondent, that gets logged, and then it's apparently so easy to access somebody if you're one of these federal employees with this clearance? It just seems like it's setting up such an unhealthy superstate that, yes, East Germany would have died for this, to have this kind of capacity. Is that America? So I'm definitely on the pro side of those men, but I haven't quite formulated how I describe it.
Yes, in the late 70s, as a teenager, I'd actually shipped up the book Operation Keelhaul, along with things like Major Jordan's Diaries, The Actor, and a number of other books. So I was familiar with a lot of the things you've said. I'm curious, well, I have kind of two questions. A, what time frame or what incidences does your current book cover? And I guess the second and larger question is, back then, both during during World War II and also in the 70s and ever since, the truth tellers have been fought by those setting the narrative. Back then, it was a different game than it is today. Now we have the internet. There's a much more larger, freer flow of information, and I would think that the truth tellers would have a better chance at winning these days. But it doesn't seem to be happening, or at least not as much as it could be with the freer flow of information. I just was wondering, I guess the latter question is, how do we win this fight?
Yeah, well, to take your second question first, I think that you still get to a choke point to the corridors of power, to Washington. So even if the internet can support all manner of discourse, can support various investigations or findings or things that seem to be challenging the narrative, they remain over there. And everything still remains inside the Beltway, completely unaffected by it. I mean, it's astonishing to read the Beltway papers, whatever, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post, and just see what they consider the parameters of news that should be covered. So that doesn't change, and I don't know how that changes. And so therefore, even when the representatives come from the rest of the country and come to Washington, they too join this sort of small circle. And I suppose they still can suffer consequences back home, but there does seem to still be a disconnect. And as for your first question, in terms of time frame, my book starts in the present and ends in the present, and takes in really from the 30s to the 90s before coming back to the present. It does have several chapters in the middle that really drill down on what happened in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then I kind of come forward a bit to really, I think, the worst American, you thought you heard the worst already, the worst American betrayal, which is the document trail that suggests or demonstrates that the United States left thousands of GIs to Stalin after World War II. And this is another amazing primary source archive that has not been made known to the American people. I started with, in this case, this was an amazing thing. It was Boris Yeltsin again. He comes to the United States for his first mini summit with President Bush the father, and he wants to talk about American servicemen in the Gulag. That he's just coming to understand, and he gives a few interviews about this, and you watch the Bush administration try to shoot him down. The transcript was wrong, he was drunk, he was wrong, we've looked into this. I mean, it's kind of I go through some of this in the book, and then you end up with a POW investigation that never really nets too much. But it turns out that, and some of you may be well aware of this, that in 1990, staff in the U.S. Senate and the Foreign Relations Committee, minority staff, then working for Jesse Helms, put together a remarkable narrative based on cables that span every war we've ever, really every war of the 20th century, from World War I, World War II, Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, indicating, yes, American men were left behind. And the largest group, which is the Shakaru, because who thinks of this, came out of the World War II cohort. And these would be the men who had been prisoners in Nazi, prisoner of war camps. British as well. And when they were liberated by the Red Army, they became prisoners of Stalin's, and the document trail shows that they were left. And so that would be something that Yeltsin seemed to be wanting to bring to light in about 1992 or so. And the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, did not want to talk about it. And that's when I started trying to understand this notion of how aligned we were, or how intertwined we were with the whole Soviet enterprise over the decades, that it was more important to keep it down than to expose it. And then when you match that to President Herbert Walker Bush's first reactions when the Soviet Union starts to unravel and the wall and so on comes down, and he wants to support Gorbachev. He tells the Ukrainians not to indulge in suicidal nationalism. Amazing for an American president to have that kind of reaction, but this was the status quo. And then Yeltsin comes along, very erratic character, as we've all learned, very mercurial in so many ways, but it seemed like he was really trying to bring something to light. And ultimately, in 2005, the POW MIA Commission admitted, yes, there were American men from every conflict in the Gulag. It was true, and it was sort of like, who knew? You know, did President Bush say anything about it? No. If we heard anything about it since, did they run up a POW MIA flag for a day? Nothing. Nothing. And the figures are vague. They probably always will be. But there is documented evidence of these men, and this was something that the government did in May and June of 1945. That we don't think about when we look back at the good war and the narrative, the pageant. Again, something, it's ugly, it's terrifying, it's awful. It's the worst thing to read about, really, but it seems to have happened. And I think it's something, again, needs to be faced up to and really understood and really followed. So, long answer to your question, it comes up in terms of the inner chapters up to the 90s, and then the first chapter and the last chapter are modern day.
From your view, what's the relationship between socialism and Islam?
Well, I don't know about the relationship. The parallels are quite clear. It's something that, this is something that I may have quickly. Oh, the question was the relationship between Islam and socialism, and this is an interesting comment by Bertrand Russell, who visited the Soviet Union in about 1920, I think it was, and he was trying to explain communism. Again, this is right after the Russian Revolution. He's trying to explain communism to a European audience, and he writes, Bolshevism combines the characteristics of the French Revolution with those of the rise of Islam. Marx has taught that communism is fatally predestined to come about. This produces a state of mind not unlike that of the early successors of Muhammad. Among religions, Bolshevism is to be reckoned with Mohammedism, your word, rather than with Christianity and Buddhism. Christianity and Buddhism are primarily personal religions with mystical doctrines and a love of contemplation. Mohammedanism and Bolshevism are practical, social, unspiritual, concerned to win the empire of this world. And?
That's a quick one.
Yes.
In the 1950s, apparently. In the 1950s, apparently, certain humorists used to say this. They would convert the Islamic creed to the communist creed, and they said, there is no God, and Karl Marx is his prophet. So that's a quick way of saying it.
I have a quick question, and this actually comes from me. At what point does an ideology either socialism, Islamism, or whatever, become actually seditious and treasonous to the government? At what point can you just have the ideology versus acting upon it? Where does that line draw? Where does the government have to take action? Where do people have to take action?
Well, that's a great question, but we need a constitutional lawyer to answer it. But that said, if you give me a little latitude on it, I think that it becomes, when the ideology or the rule, the set of laws that the creed follows are designed to destroy our set of laws, our Constitution. It seems to me that that is where these issues come to play and should be explored and should be defined. It's not good enough just to kind of pretend it's not there, but that is what we do. And certainly with a religion like Islam, which does not accept a law made by men, does not accept it. So there is a tension there right from the start, and then how it is acted upon becomes, I think, where the trigger probably lies.
I'm actually following up where do, we have the right as citizens to arrest people for misdemeanors. Where does that come into play, where we have to say, excuse me, I'm sorry, this person is being obviously seditious, obviously traitorous. Where do we have the right to, as citizens, to say, listen, this person needs to be arrested, and actually put them under arrest and turn them over to the authorities?
You mean see something, say something?
Yes.
No, I'm not trying to be smart. I don't know. I mean, I suppose that could be
We are
right.
the purveyors. We, the people, are the purveyors of are the givers of the Constitution, giver of the laws, and we have the power as citizens to arrest people for misdemeanors, and we have the obligation to arrest them if they're committing a felony. Otherwise, we're in trouble. So where do we become law enforcement officers when the law enforcement officers stop doing the job?
Well, I don't know where the line between vigilantism and
No, it's legal arrest.
legal unrest. I don't know. I mean that I suppose it's something to think about, especially when the government fails to fill the breach. I mean that if you tell the government something like that at this point, there are many instances where it would be probably you put you in jeopardy for all manner of yeah.
Diana, there's so many remarkable revelations in the book, but one of the most remarkable to me was, if you could describe it just briefly, was I think it was 2009 Chabad Lubavitcher and Admiral Canaris. Could you share that with us? Since we're at a temple, it's
Sure.
an interesting story.
Well, it is. I mentioned in passing this man, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who is the head of the German intelligence agency Abwehr, who was one of the contacts with Americans, actually, and British as well, trying to get some kind of understanding or some kind of aid, and got nowhere. He even traveled, I read in one history book that he traveled blindfolded to British intelligence headquarters inside Paris during the war to meet unsuccessfully again. And when you track that back, there were some British intelligence people who wrote later memoirs, or at least one I'm thinking of in particular, who thought, it was a great idea, and why did we care so much about offending the Russians that we wouldn't, take this more seriously? This was the mindset, offending the Russians, and the notion of the alliance becoming more important even than ending the war potentially early, I think becomes a very legitimate observation from this. It does seem to become the primary focus, keeping Russia happy, keeping Stalin happy. And if you're talking about ending the war early and working with these people who are anti-communist and don't want to see a Russian emergence into Europe, it becomes evident that there's a sickness really here in terms of not wanting to end the war sooner rather than placate, or preferring to placate Stalin. Canaris also tried with this man George Earle, who is one of my my favorite people in the book. Interesting character, an American aristocrat. I think in World War I he used his own yacht in the Navy and won medals and things like that. He apparently rode with Pershing after Pancho Villa and all manner of daring do. And anyway, he was this fellow with the champagne bottle who hit the Nazi officer. So a very appealing kind of character, a man of action. He was one of the people trying to work with Canaris and then some of the other Germans later on in 1943. And I will add that when I went to find his letters in the Harry Hopkins collection at Georgetown University, in this period, there's a folder that is listed in the directory of the Hopkins collection as being George Earle's letters. And this was the period where George Earle was working with these various people in Europe, these various Germans. It had been cleaned out. The file was absolutely cleaned out. There was nothing in the file. It was gone. And there was a little note that I quote in the book somewhere, and the words are to the effect, these papers were removed to Harry Hopkins' home in about November 1944. Well, they didn't seem to come back. I don't know what happened to them. And I remember reading this. I was in the library, and I looked up at the librarian and said, what do we do now? There's nothing to do. They're gone. But I did find one letter out of order in another file that was a George Earle letter. And this was the letter I also quote in the book where he basically sets up his own line of communication. He was Roosevelt's direct emissary, and he set up his line of communication through Hopkins. So presumably all of his, whatever offers he was getting from these Germans and whatever else he was doing in Europe, because he was doing other things, would be going through Hopkins. We don't know where it went from there. But he didn't get anywhere. Anyway, this man Canaris, in the thing that Andy is referring to, in 2009, there was a movement to induct him into Yad Vashem, because he was able to save a number of Jews in Poland. And this was, more evidence that, there was this kind of activity going on under the horrific activities, mostly of what was going on at the same time. So that's the one you're talking about.
Actually, more of a statement. You should know that my daughter wrote, wow, she's cool. A lot of information. You think she'd like to come to my college to speak?
Yay!
Well, no. Wait a minute, let me finish this. Tell her to bring Alan West, too.
That's darling.
Last time, somebody noted that you and Alan West share a last name. He said, he's my sister.
He's my brother.
There we go. I'd like to thank Diana West for coming. I hope everybody found it an enjoyable evening. Those of you in cyberspace who are watching, welcome. If you'd like to help us here and what we do through the speaker series, please once again visit jstevents.com and we'll be able to help you out. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
That's true, by the way. She texted.
That's adorable. That's great.
I've got a bunch of pictures I suspect I'm going to be taking, but the first one will be taken.
Oh, absolutely.
Right by the American flag, right by the Israeli flag.